The room was buzzing with cameras flashing, reporters scribbling in their notepads, and the audience leaning in, hungry for a moment of drama. President Joe Biden stood at the podium, delivering what was supposed to be a standard policy speech. But then, with that familiar smirk, he decided to go off script. His gaze locked on Karoline Leavitt, who was seated in the front row, notebook in hand. "You know," Biden said, his voice dripping with condescension, "some folks out there think they're political heavyweights, but they're really just loud voices with nothing to say." The crowd chuckled, sensing the jab. He didn't name her directly, but the implication was sharp enough to draw a few murmurs. "Some people's entire resume," Biden continued, "is just parroting the same talking points over and over. That's not leadership, that's just noise." Karoline's eyes narrowed. She was used to political sniping, but something about the president's tone lit a fire in her. She wasn't just going to sit there and take it, especially not in front of the press. She straightened her posture, her expression unreadable, but in her mind, she was already preparing her strike. The moment the speech wrapped, reporters swarmed her for a reaction. Biden had barely stepped away from the podium when Karoline spoke into the nearest microphone, her voice steady but fierce. "The President of the United States just mocked me for doing my job, speaking the truth. And here's my response, Mr. Biden, your policies are failing this country, your leadership is collapsing, and your insults can't hide the fact that America is weaker under your watch." Her words cut through the noise like a blade. Cameras clicked furiously, reporters shouted follow-up questions, and the video began making its way online before the event even ended. Within hours, hashtags like #Karoline Clapback and #BidenBurn were trending nationwide. And Karoline wasn't done yet. She promised to address the president's remarks in detail later that evening, teasing her supporters with the promise of an unfiltered, gloves-off response. For Biden, what started as a throwaway jab had just ignited a viral political storm, one that Karoline seemed more than ready to ride straight into the heart of the national conversation. The clip from earlier that day was everywhere, on TV, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. Biden's smirk and dismissive words were replayed over and over, often paired with captions mocking Karoline. But what his supporters didn't expect was how fast she would flip the narrative. Karoline didn't wait for the next news cycle, she took control of it. Within hours, she was on a live stream, speaking directly to her audience, her tone sharp and unflinching. "Let me be very clear," she began, leaning forward toward the camera. "The president thinks it's funny to belittle people who disagree with him. But here's the truth, mockery doesn't hide incompetence." She then went point by point, dismantling his policies with receipts in hand: rising inflation, border chaos, foreign policy blunders. She didn't just throw insults, she presented a rapid-fire case for why Biden's leadership was, in her words, an embarrassment on the world stage. Clips from the live stream started trending almost immediately. Even networks that rarely gave her airtime aired segments of her response, unable to ignore the sheer force of her words. Biden's jab was supposed to make her look small, but it had the opposite effect. Now, it was his off-script comment that was under the microscope, with headlines questioning whether it was presidential to attack a political opponent so personally. Karoline's team seized the moment. They pushed hashtags like #mocked by Biden and #truth-over-trolling, turning what could have been a fleeting insult into a sustained political offensive. She scheduled appearances on primetime shows, ensuring that the conversation wouldn't fade for days. By nightfall, the political battlefield had shifted. Biden's side was on the defensive, explaining the context of his remarks, while Karoline's supporters flooded social media, rallying behind her with messages like, "She spoke for all of us." The dynamic had changed, and it was clear Karoline wasn't going to let the momentum slip away. The next morning, the White House press pool expected the story to fade. After all, the president had laughed off tougher opponents before. But Karoline wasn't letting this one go. She booked herself on one of the highest-rated morning talk shows, walking onto the set in a bright, commanding color that screamed confidence. From the very first question, she flipped the script. Instead of reacting defensively, she leaned into Biden's mockery, repeating his exact words with a smirk and then countering, "That's the sound of a leader who's out of arguments and out of ideas." The studio audience gave an audible gasp. She followed with a methodical dismantling of his record, each point sharper than the last. When the host pressed her about whether she was taking his comment too seriously, she shot back, "When the President of the United States chooses personal insults over policy, that's not a joke, it's a weakness. And weakness in leadership costs Americans every single day." Social media caught fire again. Clips of that moment spread faster than the original incident. Memes flipped Biden's smirk into a symbol of being outplayed. Her supporters posted side-by-side videos, Biden's jab versus Karoline's retort, with captions like, "Who's laughing now?" Meanwhile, Biden's communication team scrambled. They tried to pivot to unrelated talking points, but journalists kept circling back. Even political commentators who rarely agreed with Karoline acknowledged that she'd taken control of the conversation, and that Biden had walked right into it. By midday, the narrative wasn't "Biden mocks Karoline" anymore. It was "Karoline outmaneuvers Biden." What was supposed to be a fleeting embarrassment had become a political turning point, and Karoline was making sure the echo of that clash would linger for weeks. Later that week, the showdown moved to prime time. A major evening news program invited both Karoline and a seasoned political analyst to discuss the president's jab. The producers expected a polite exchange with a few soundbites, but Karoline came armed for a full-scale rhetorical strike. The host began with a replay of Biden's remark, the crowd's laughter still audible. Karoline didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned forward, locked eyes with the camera, and said, "If this administration put as much effort into securing our borders, protecting our economy, and defending our freedoms as they do mocking their critics, America would be in a much better place right now." The panel went silent for a beat. Then, she shifted gears, laying out a three-point plan she said Biden should have been talking about instead of her. Each point was crisp, tangible, and laced with contrasts between her vision and the current administration's record. The analyst tried to push back, claiming Biden was just being playful, but Karoline didn't let him off the hook. "Oh, playful," she said, her tone cutting through the noise. "There's nothing playful about inflation eating up paychecks. There's nothing playful about mothers afraid to walk their kids to school in unsafe neighborhoods. And there's nothing playful about a president who laughs when the people he works for are struggling." That moment hit the airwaves like a lightning bolt. Hashtags like #PlayfulPresident and #LaughingWhileWeSuffer began trending. Clips racked up millions of views overnight. Even late-night comedians started roasting Biden, not for the joke he made, but for how spectacularly Karoline had flipped it against him. By the time the segment wrapped, the narrative was no longer about Karoline being mocked, it was about Biden underestimating someone who had turned his own stage into hers. She had taken the moment he tried to use to humiliate her and forged it into a weapon, aimed squarely at his credibility. And the more they replayed that clip, the sharper it cut. The following morning, Karoline's team released a short, razor-edited clip of her on that news panel, zero filler, just the kill shots. The video opened with Biden's smirk and sarcastic jab, then cut immediately to her dismantling the narrative in under 30 seconds. The pacing was brutal, the kind of social media edit that hits like a punch and leaves no room for spin. As the clip began spreading, Karoline doubled down with a series of posts. She wrote, "Mock me all you want. My job is to speak for the people who are tired of being laughed at by their own leaders." That line resonated like a war cry. Comment sections flooded with agreement, and even some Biden voters admitted the president had crossed a line. By mid-afternoon, her comms team had booked her for a high-profile podcast appearance. The host asked if she took Biden's remark personally. Karoline's answer was sharp and calculated, "It's not about me, it's about the office he holds. When the commander-in-chief treats Americans' concerns as a punchline, he's mocking every single citizen." My response wasn't personal, it was necessary. She didn't stop there. Karoline pivoted into a larger critique of what she called leadership by insult, arguing that it's a dangerous substitute for accountability. She pointed to rising costs, broken border security promises, and declining trust in institutions as evidence that the jokes were a distraction from failures. The podcast host, clearly taken aback, admitted she hadn't expected Karoline to turn a comedic jab into a pointed policy discussion, but that's exactly why the segment went viral again. It wasn't just the fire in her delivery, it was the fact she was reframing the narrative every time someone tried to diminish her. By evening, Biden's comment was no longer a win for him in the public arena. Instead, political talk shows were debating how his light-hearted moment had turned into a messaging disaster, and Karoline had positioned herself as the one who exposed it. Her mockery to policy, counterattack wasn't just reactive, it was a masterclass in flipping political theater into political capital. By the time night fell, Karoline had turned what could have been a fleeting embarrassment into a full-blown narrative shift. She appeared on a primetime news slot, the host clearly eager to replay Biden's mocking smirk for millions of viewers. The moment the clip ended, Karoline leaned forward and delivered a line she had clearly prepared. If making fun of an American woman on stage is this administration's idea of leadership, then maybe that's why they're losing the trust of the very people they claim to represent. Her tone was calm but razor-sharp, and the live audience in the studio erupted into applause. This wasn't a rant, it was precision strike communication, designed to leave no room for misinterpretation. She followed it up with a devastating contrast. The camera cut to images of everyday Americans struggling, long lines at grocery stores, chaotic border scenes, rising gas prices, while Karoline's voiceover asked, "Is this funny to you, Mr. President?" The network didn't have to add commentary, the visual juxtaposition did all the heavy lifting. The next morning, Biden's press team attempted damage control, framing the moment as light-hearted banter. But by then, the narrative had hardened online. This wasn't harmless humor, it was a bad read of the national mood. Hashtags like #NotAFunnyTime and #mockery from the top began trending, propelled by both Karoline supporters and neutral voters who thought the remark was out of touch. Karoline seized the moment again, issuing a statement that blended empathy with defiance. "This isn't about politics. It's about respect. You can disagree with me all day, but you don't get to mock the people I speak for." That line was clipped, memed, and repeated across every major social platform. By the weekend, political commentators were calling her response a case study in message jiujitsu, the art of using your opponent's attack to amplify your own reach. Biden's comment had been meant as a throwaway laugh. Karoline had turned it into a defining political moment, and she wasn't done yet. The moment Joe Biden leaned slightly forward on stage, flashing that smirk that has become a hallmark of his political jabs, the audience tensed. Cameras zoomed in. This was the part everyone knew was coming, the punchline aimed squarely at Karoline Leavitt. "Some people talk a big game," Biden began, his voice dripping with condescension, "but they've never been in the ring." His words hung in the air, accompanied by a dismissive chuckle, and the crowd reacted with a ripple of laughter that felt more like a provocation than amusement. Karoline didn't flinch. She didn't even shift in her seat. Her eyes locked on him, unblinking, absorbing every syllable as if she were cataloging evidence for a cross-examination. The political theater was playing out in real time, Biden trying to land a stinging blow, Karoline patiently waiting for her turn to strike back. When the moderator turned to her for a response, she didn't rush. She adjusted the microphone, took a measured breath, and let the silence stretch just enough to pull every eye toward her. Then, in a voice that carried the clarity of both conviction and precision, she said, "Mr. President, I don't need to be in your ring to recognize when the fight is rigged. While you've been busy perfecting your punchlines, Americans have been living with the consequences of your policies, higher prices, a weaker border, and a country more divided than ever." The shift in the room was instant. The smirks disappeared. Biden's eyes narrowed, as though he hadn't expected a direct counterpunch this sharp. But Karoline wasn't finished. "You call me inexperienced, but I call myself uncorrupted. I haven't been in Washington long enough to forget who I work for, the American people. Not special interests. Not political elites. And certainly not those who think being on a stage makes them untouchable. A murmur ran through the audience, some cheers, some gasps. Biden leaned back, his earlier grin gone. The cameras caught the flicker of discomfort in his expression. Karoline's words weren't just a rebuttal, they were a dismantling. She had reframed the moment from a comedic swipe into a political reckoning, and she'd done it with surgical precision. By the time she finished, the crowd's energy had shifted entirely. The applause was louder, sharper, the sound of a room realizing they had just witnessed a turning point. And in that instant it was clear, Biden had tried to mock her, but she had stolen the moment, flipped it, and sent it back at him with force. Biden had expected her to play defense. He had expected a quick, safe reply, something polished but forgettable. What he hadn't counted on was Karoline's ability to flip his own stage into her battlefield. As soon as she leaned forward, her hands gripping the edge of the podium, there was no mistaking it, she was about to go on the offensive. "Mr. President," she began, her tone crisp but sharp, "mockery might get you applause in this room, but it doesn't fix grocery bills, it doesn't stop the fentanyl pouring across our borders, and it certainly doesn't heal the divisions your leadership has deepened." She paused for effect, letting the words slice through the artificial politeness that often shields political debates from real confrontation. Biden tried to interject with a half-smile and a dismissive wave, but Karoline raised her voice, cutting cleanly over his. "You call me inexperienced because I haven't been in Washington long enough to play your games. But I see that as my greatest strength. I haven't been there long enough to sell out the people I represent. I haven't been there long enough to forget that the job is to serve, not to perform." The room felt smaller now, as though the lights themselves had tightened their focus on the two of them. Biden's easy swagger began to fade. Cameras caught him blinking, shifting slightly, his hand resting a little too long on the podium as she spoke. Karoline's delivery wasn't just confident, it was surgical. She drew on specifics, calling out the administration's economic missteps, the failed promises on border security, the disconnect between D.C. politicians and the working-class families they claim to fight for. "It's not about being in your ring," she said, her eyes never leaving his, "because your ring is broken. And the American people are tired of watching politicians shadowbox while their lives get harder." By the time she finished, there was no laughter in the room. Even those inclined to side with Biden found themselves leaning forward, as if they didn't want to miss the next blow. The applause wasn't polite, it was a release. A sign that she had managed to shift the energy, wrestle control of the narrative, and force her opponent into a position he rarely occupies, silent and on the back foot. The look on Biden's face said it all. He'd tried to turn Karoline into a punchline. Instead, she had turned him into a cautionary tale, live, in front of the entire country. The moderators had moved to the next question, but Biden couldn't resist circling back to his earlier jab, tossing out another mocking comment with a grin that suggested he thought the moment was already his. Karoline didn't let him finish. She straightened in her chair, leaned toward the microphone, and with a voice like a steel blade cutting through noise, she went in for the kill. "Mr. President, you've had nearly 5 decades in Washington," she said, her tone calm but charged. "And in that time, you've mastered the art of the soundbite, but not the art of results. You call me inexperienced because I'm not part of the old political machine. But maybe that's exactly why I still remember what leadership is supposed to look like." The crowd shifted, sensing something about to erupt. Biden tried to laugh it off again, but the chuckle caught in his throat as Karoline kept pushing. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't need to. Every word was deliberate, sharp, and impossible to dismiss. "You talk about unity while vilifying half the country. You talk about compassion while leaving our borders open and our communities vulnerable. You talk about the economy while families watch their paychecks vanish before they make it home from the grocery store." She paused, letting the silence fill with the weight of the accusations. "And then you stand here and mock me? That's not leadership, that's theater. A few gasps broke through the audience, along with murmurs that betrayed a shift in the room's energy. She had hit the point where the debate stopped being about policy and became about power, and Biden suddenly looked like a man who had lost it. Karoline pressed the advantage. You've spent your career perfecting your image. I'm here to hold up the mirror. And if you don't like the reflection, maybe it's not me who needs to change. The audience erupted, not with the polite applause that follows a well-rehearsed talking point, but with the raw, charged reaction of people witnessing someone seize the moment. Biden's smile had evaporated entirely now, replaced with a look halfway between irritation and disbelief. Karoline didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She simply leaned back, hands folded, as if to say, "Your move, Mr. President." But they both knew the round was over, and she had taken it. Biden's hands tightened on the podium, his notes shuffling just enough to betray a flicker of unease. The camera zoomed in, catching every shift in his expression. Karoline could see it, the opening, and she didn't waste a second. "Mr. President," she began, her voice steady but edged with steel, "you can keep trying to paint me as unqualified, too young, or too new. But here's the truth. You've been in office long enough to write history books about your failures." The air went cold. The crowd drew in a collective breath, sensing something seismic about to land. "You inherited a nation that was strong," she continued, leaning forward, "and you've drained its spirit. Our border is overrun. Our cities are unsafe. Our debt is crushing the middle class. And your answer? Mock the people calling you out. That's not leadership, that's cowardice." The moderators shifted in their seats, glancing between each other like they were watching a fire spread too fast to control. Biden tried to cut in, raising his hand to speak, but Karoline didn't give him the space. "You call yourself a unifier, but you've divided this country more than I've seen in my lifetime. You talk about protecting democracy, yet you silence dissent. And tonight, you thought a cheap joke would shut me down. Well," she paused, locking eyes with him in a moment that froze the entire room. "I don't shut down. I fight back." The audience erupted, the sound ricocheting off the walls like an earthquake. Biden's face hardened, but there was no comeback waiting on his tongue this time. Karoline's gaze didn't waver. "The American people don't need a performer," she said. "They need a fighter. And if you're not ready to be that, then step aside, because I am." She leaned back, slow and deliberate, the silence after her words somehow louder than the cheers before. Biden looked down at his notes, then out at the crowd, and for the first time that night, he had nothing left to say. Karoline stepped back to the podium for her final words, her voice calm yet charged with the energy of the night. "Tonight wasn't about me, and it sure wasn't about your jokes, Mr. President," she said, her eyes locked on Biden. "It was about the people watching from their living rooms, the ones struggling to buy groceries, to fill their gas tanks, to keep their families safe. They don't need another politician who talks down to them. They need someone who will stand up for them." She let the silence settle for a moment, then drove it home. "You've had decades to get it right. And if this is the best you can offer, division, mockery, and excuses, then it's time for you to step aside. America's future doesn't belong to the past. It belongs to the fighters, the doers, and the believers. And I promise you this, I'm not going anywhere." With that, she gave the crowd one last unwavering look, a subtle nod, and stepped away from the mic. The applause was deafening, but it wasn't the sound that mattered, it was the shift in the room. Biden had spoken all night, but Karoline had owned the moment.